Okay, so these are notes 14.4 over a war on two fronts. So we're going to talk primarily about Europe, but we'll also talk a little bit about the Pacific and at least what was happening over there. Um, so when we look at the Axis and the Allies, we find that they really didn't compare in as far as strategies. The Allies not only fought together, but they also worked together on a strategy. Their strategies were together, their troops were together, and their goals for achieving certain areas were together. So they basically put those together. The Axis, and they basically took different areas. They might have had, basically talked about it or had conversations about it, but it wasn't so much that they coordinated things together. It wasn't like the Italians and the Germans didn't get together and share tactics and things like that, but primarily the Italians are going to fight in North Africa, and they'll have some help from the Germans, but you won't see a whole lot of Italians fighting, say, the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. The Americans adopted what was called the Europe First strategy. The Europe First strategy was basically that we were going to take Europe first because um, they would they saw Germany as the most formidable threat, the biggest piece of the puzzle that needed to be taken care of. And then after they would basically either severely decrease or make a difference in the war in Europe, they would try to end the war in Asia. It wasn't like they didn't do anything in Asia, it was just the focus was in Europe. You also have to remember a lot of the resources were on the eastern side of the United States, not on the western side of the United States, so it's easier to move resources than to try and to sail, you know, all the way around to the Pacific Ocean. Um, some of the things that we had to do um, in the war in Atlantic was deal with the submarine battle. So that was our probably our biggest piece of it. And this map really shows the overall convoy system that we had to enact, and the reason being for that would be because of the submarines. The submarines had sunk more than 3,500 um, uh, just merchant ships. Not even these weren't even military ships; they were merchant ships. So there's a couple of things that we enacted. One was the convoy system. So we traveled in the convoy system here, and you can see where they met once they get close to the European continent, and then and that probably was within that bounds of um, U-boat patrolling, basically. The other thing that we used was radar to find the submarines, and then also um, we used depth charges. The depth charges were basically things that we would use from our battleships to try to destroy the submarines. Now, there's more on that, but we won't go into detail on that. As we can see in this particular picture, you can kind of see the Allied strategy when they marched through Berlin to mark the surrender of France. Basically, those are all Nazi troops. There's not Italian troops and others mixed together there. Or on the contrary, we're going to fight with the French and the British together, and even our units will be kind of not combined together in that they have the same commanding officer on smaller units, but basically fighting in the same battles together. If we look at war goals, we can see that the one of the reasons why they were different is because Germany focused on dominating Europe and eliminating the inferior people. Um, Italy wanted to create their Italian empire. They weren't so concerned about inferior people or anything. They just wanted an empire. And Japan was trying to take control of the Western Pacific and East Asia. We, on the other hand, the three major powers from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, was to defeat the Axis. That basically was our goal, and that's why we were more unified. Hitler sent three armies to Europe, primarily into the Soviet Union. That should probably read the Soviet Union. That would make more sense. But oh well, we'll leave it as it may. Um, but one thing that he didn't plan on was the stop and advancement because of winter. So what he did is um, he sent one toward Leningrad, one toward Moscow, and one toward the the Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad was like Stalin's main center. It was like the capital. It was what some people would call Stalin's baby or Stalin's um, special city, I guess you could say. So that was really a big point that Hitler wanted to um, take control of, but he was not able to do that. In fact, when it became really slow for one, and then they basically were cut off. The Soviets had broken through and came around kind of like the backside, a little bit of what we call almost a hook maneuver, but not quite in the same way we see in ancient civilizations. And so they kind of did more of a um, like the battle turned into this house to house, clearing each house, um, uh, kind of almost I want to call guerrilla, more like urban warfare, what we would call it today. Um, they basically, when they were cut off, Hitler tried to bring a couple armies in to free them, and he couldn't seem to do that. And eventually, they were kind of starved out. So just they surrendered on January 31st, 1943, on the Eastern Front. That really stops any really big plans on the Eastern Front. It's not that they stop fighting, it's just it really stops the overall advancement in that area. Hitler never really goes on the offensive again, he goes to a defensive. The Allies decided to avoid the fortified area of France and go into North Africa before attempting to get to mainland Europe. So Al Alamein was the victory for the British there. You can see on this particular map right here in Egypt that the Allies go down and take this area here. But then they basically kind of chase the Germans and the Italians back to Tunisia. Tunisia, under the command of Eisenhower and with uh, fighting Rommel, which was also called the Desert Fox here in this picture, um, basically they pushed them back to Tunisia, which is really close to Sicily in the middle of the um, Mediterranean Sea, which connects directly to Italy. So he basically kind of traps them there. Patton does that. Now, Patton, that doesn't mean that Dwight Eisenhower wasn't over the troops. He was, but Patton was like kind of like the ground commander, and he was very energetic and big on offensive rather than defensive. He was willing to take risk. Now, as you can see here, here's an example of bombers and U-boats using depth charges and bombers overall. If we look here of the German invasions of the Soviet Union, here's the three. I probably should have shown that before. Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. And you can see 1941 is really when he has these offensive. But he decides to focus on the south here to get these oil fields down here by the Black Sea. And that's where he kind of makes a mistake. He's not able to accomplish that. They hold out there. So in Casablanca, basically it's called the Casablanca Conference. FDR and Churchill meet to decide, and they decide that they will accept nothing but unconditional surrender, meaning if they take these countries will not keep their government. Hitler will be out of power. Mussolini will be out of power. There will not be an option. So after that conference, basically the Allies began to invade. This will be in the year 1943. Allies began to invade Sicily and then on to mainland Italy. They take mainland Italy, but not northern Italy because there was a lot of mountains and areas like that that prevented them from moving quickly northward. So in September of 1943, the Italian government surrenders. But as we look at some of the northern part of Italy here, you can see that well, you might not be able to see it here, but basically this is kind of a rough terrain. So Hitler flies Mussolini out with some commandos and makes him the head of a puppet state of northern Italy. So we had this area of Italy here, but technically Mussolini stayed the head of the northern state, although the Italian government surrendered. Here's a picture of FDR, Churchill, the leader of the French government, prime minister, I believe. Allies began to saturation bomb Germany. What that means is basically they bomb anywhere and everywhere with the most amount of damage that they can make. They also start to do what's called strategic bombing. This is an offensive. They find every factory, they find every major train track, anything they can to destroy the capacity to make war. The strategic bombing is basically anything that had war materials was a target. They flew primarily at night, although the casualty rate was really high, not only with down planes, but also getting down into Germany caused a overall issue because a lot of them were shot down, or when they got on the ground, they were shot. So if you, there's a couple films out there even showing some of the um, struggles some of the bombers had at that time. Tuskegee Airmen was an African American fighter squadron that escorted the fighters would escort the bombers to try to keep off some of the Luftwaffe planes, but that uh, overall was it was a segregated unit in that it was only African American, but they made quite the name for themselves and really helped to overall, especially when we come back to the civil rights era. We're just going to briefly talk about the Pacific. We could spend days on the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal. There's some great films out there even on that. The Midway and the Aleutian Islands were a part of the Japanese attack plan. The Aleutian Islands are up here in Alaska. This little piece of Alaska here, they were going to try to take some of those Aleutian Islands. Some of those islands were literally only the rate of like um, some of them being like maybe even 5 miles. They weren't that big. They were really small islands. Battle of Midway was basically, even though we had the Hawaiian Islands here, it was a Navy headquarters, and if they could take that, they would basically threaten them, since we had lost some of our naval fleet here, to force them back to the coast of California by taking Midway, because Midway was a really important point because it was halfway in between Japan and Hawaii. In the Battle of Midway, we sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and they only sank one of ours. We stopped the Japanese offensive. We stopped all these arrows coming our direction, and you can see they've taken places like New Guinea, the Philippines, all these areas that they take control of. But also, they basically, after this, we see that final line around there, they don't really go beyond that line after the Battle of Midway. It is the turning point in the Pacific where we switch from a defensive war to an offensive war. Battle of the island of Guadalcanal was another important one, and the Battle of Guadalcanal is a part of that. But the Battle of Midway is probably one of the most important ones to remember overall because it was that turning point in the war. We'll come back a little bit later, probably the notes 14.5, and talk a little more about the Pacific overall.